Without further ado, I will let Barney introduce the topic of the first World Series. It's a different title, isn't it?
Yay. Okay. Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you everyone for coming out. I appreciate it. I bet you didn't know this, but we're going to start off with a quiz. So I'm going to give you a series of nicknames, because in the 1880s, baseball was awash in what historian Bill James called singular nicknames. So I'm going to read off some names. I want you to raise your hand if you think that that nickname is real or not. I may have made up a few of these just to kind of be on the fun side. So when I read off a nickname, I want you to put your hands up if you think it's real. Okay. So the first one that is on this list is the Apollo of the box.
Yeah.
The Apollo of the box. Sure. Okay. Indeed, that is a real nickname. It's a nickname for a man named Tim Lane, who was a pitcher, a very handsome man, who was reputed to be the source of what became known as ladies' days in the 1890s, and that ladies could show up for free if they were accompanied by a male guest. Okay. How about this? George White Wings Tebow. White Wings Tebow.
Real.
Okay. It is in fact real. George Tebow was an outfielder for 4 different teams in the 1880s and 1890s, and he got the nickname White Wings not because he was fast on the bases, he did steal a lot of bases in his time, but it's because he worked as a garbage man in the off-season. Where he worked, they were known as White Wings. So he got the name White Wings Tebow because he worked as a garbage man. How about this? Ted Bank Street Sullivan. Bank Street. Oh man, you're good. I couldn't fool you on that. That was made up. Ted Sullivan was a real guy. He worked as a scout for the Northwest League and for the St. Louis ball clubs in the 1880s and 90s. He was actually very, very important in the formation of what became known as the Northwest League, a very good minor league at that time. Okay, one more. How about Chicken Wolf? Chicken Wolf? Chicken Wolf, real, unreal? Chicken Wolf is actually a real person. His real name was Leonard Van Winkle Wolf. And he was called Chicken because he got sick during a game once because he ate chicken beforehand, and his teammate, who was nicknamed Gladiator, Pete Browning, who was also the original Louisville Slugger, took to calling him Chicken because that's what he ate, and then it stuck, so he was Chicken Wolf. The 1880s were full of great nicknames, like Chicken, but also like a man named Sure Shot Dunlop, who was a second baseman. He was called Sure Shot because he could throw really well and he was a good fielder. So if you hit the ball at him, it was a sure out because it was a sure shot that he would throw to first base and throw you out. And that's why I got interested in 19th century baseball. When I was 15 years old, I got a book called Total Baseball from my brother's Christmas gift. And I looked up the 1884 Union Association, as I was flipping through pages, and I noticed that this man, Dunlop, led the league in runs, hits, home runs, batting average, on-base percentage, slugging percentage. He was the best player in the league by a wide margin, and I'd never even heard of him. I looked him up in the back of the book, where you see his lifetime statistics, and I found out he was a second baseman. I'm like, a second baseman leading the league in home runs? That's for Ryan Sandberg, for goodness sakes. But secondly, he was about 5'8", weighed about 175, 180 pounds.
Whoa.
And I kept thinking, this is crazy. How did this person do this? And that got me interested in 19th century baseball, especially the 1880s, because it's a fascinating time. In the 1880s, you have this real experimentation with rules, and you have this shift from the way baseball was played in the 1860s and 70s to the way baseball is played now. And if you went to a game in the 1880s and 1890s, you'd recognize it. You got a pitcher, all the fielders are there, but certain things would be a little off. Okay? And the interesting bit is that as this time period went, the game changed, but it was still different. You had 3 major leagues operating in 1884 and 1890, for that matter. And you also had 2 great teams, the St. Louis Browns and the Chicago White Stockings, who are almost completely forgotten today. But people in the Midwest know these teams because of what they became. If you ask people okay, so what's the greatest baseball rivalry?
Cubs and the Cardinals.
Yankees and Red Sox.
Got the Yankees and Cardinals. You got Cubs and the
Dodgers.
Cardinals. Giants, Dodgers. Okay. The oldest is the Cubs and the Cardinals because the Browns and the White Stockings are the Cubs and the Cardinals. And they played in 2 different World Series in the 1880s and wound up surviving. Okay. The Giants and the Dodgers certainly started, going at each other in the late 19th century, but certainly not as early as the Browns and the Cardinals. Okay, and plus, I'm biased. I'm from the Midwest, so I think Cubs and Cardinals. But these 2 teams had a huge impact and a huge influence on what came after. Okay. So here's a little bit about rule changes. And in 1881, imagine this. You go to a game at not AT&T Park, Backwell Park, whatever it is these days, and the pitcher throws and nothing's called. Pitcher throws again, nothing's called. Up until 1881, that happened. After 1881, the umpire was obligated to call a ball or a strike. Before that, he wasn't. Now keep in mind there was one umpire, not 3, not 4, not 5. There was one umpire that sat off the field in a suit, a top hat, usually on a chair. And they would call games. But at this point, in 1881, umpires had to call a ball or strike in each pitch, and the pitchers pitched at that point from a box. So if you ever hear a phrase, so-and-so got knocked out of the box in the 3rd inning, that's where that comes from. Because literally in the 19th century, they would get knocked out of the box if they pitched badly. And the pitching box originally was at 45 feet. Now you may think, good Lord, imagine Madison Bumgarner throwing a pitch at me from 45 feet away. Well, they had to throw underhand. Okay. Now this does not mean that they couldn't make the ball curve. They couldn't make the ball dive, called a drop ball. They couldn't throw a slow ball, which is now known as a changeup. But in 1885, with more and more pitchers kind of flaunting the rules, namely, if you had to throw under the waist, pitchers would find a way to put their belts up here so they could throw sidearm or they could do whatever. In 1885, pitchers were allowed to throw overhand. Okay, and at the same time, batters were not allowed anymore to ask for a high or low strike, which is in the original rules from the Knickerbockers in the 1840s. So you could go up during a game in 1884 and say, all right, that guy has to throw me a high pitch. And if he didn't, that was a ball. Now, of course, it didn't take 4 balls to get a walk. It took maybe 8 or 9, depending on what league you're in. And keep in mind, in the 1870s, if someone's just throwing pitches at you and they're not getting anywhere near where you called them, the umpire's not calling them anything at all. Or you might call 1 in 3 or 4 a strike. In 1886, the strike zone is stabilized from the shoulder to the knee. Okay? No more calling for high or low pitches. If it's between here and here, it's a strike. Okay? 1887, pitchers are allowed to take 1 step when throwing, and they have to keep a foot down when they deliver the pitch. Now, this is an interesting thing, because you may be thinking, if pitchers were allowed to only take 1 step, what could they do before? They could literally do something like this. And then throw the ball. They could literally take a running start. They could jump in the air and throw the ball if they
Oh,
wanted to.
jeez.
They could do what's called a crossfire delivery. If you're right-handed, it would look like this, where you take your left foot, put it over here, and you would go and throw it across your body. If they wanted to, they could also, if they could, throw left-handed and right-handed in the same at bat. There are 3 different pitchers who did this. They were ambidextrous, and they threw with both hands. That wasn't illegal until the 20th century. So, in 1887, you had to keep one hand down, or 1 foot down on the bottom, on the back line of the box at 50 feet. And if you're interested in where 60 feet 6 inches comes from, which is where the pitcher's mound is now, the rubber, in 1893, the box was moved back 10 feet to 60 feet, and because it was the back line of the box, the pitching rubber is put 6 inches behind that line. So hence 60 feet 6 inches. This made offense absolutely explode in the 1890s. Because before this, you have men throwing the ball very hard at people who are 50 feet away. And not just any, considering the fact that visiting teams and home teams were not supposed to supply more than 2 baseballs per game. These baseballs would just get mashed down to pulp. Sometimes they'd be hard to see. You could doctor them up with just about anything. Spitting on a ball, rubbing stuff in it was not illegal until 1920, after the death of a man named Ray Chapman, who was hit in the head with a baseball and killed. Before that, you could do whatever you want. You could stick a nail in there if you wanted to. So here, it's a wonder anyone could hit it all. Okay. But during this time in the 1880s, you had these leagues operating that played with different rules, and would also, the rules would change year to year. So it was difficult for people to find footing. It was difficult for people to actually carry on as a player. Yes, sir.
So 60 feet 6 inches then was just basically not a conscious thing? They just said, we're gonna move it back? Or was there some group that got together and said, this gives the hitter more chance? Because that's endured for like 100 years, and it seems to be perfect.
Yeah, it's one of those happy coincidences, kind of like 90 feet for the base pass. Who knows, if the hand of God reached down and said 60 feet, 6 inches, 50, who knows? But they just moved it back 10 feet. Probably, I would argue probably because it started off at 40, that they just moved it back in increments of 10 because that was a good round number. But it worked. Now, whether or not, who knows? There's discussion right now of people lowering the mound because of pitching being dominant. Now, of course, in these days and age, in the 1880s and 1890s, there was no pitching mound. You pitched off a flat surface. Okay, so I think it was just luck, to be perfectly honest. Now these are all the leagues, at least the major leagues, that were running around in the 19th century. Now the National League, still the National League right now. That was around since 1876. The American League started in 1901. They operated as the Western League before that. But all these other leagues existed and went out. And notice the terminology that's different between the National Association of Baseball Players and the National League of Baseball Clubs. And from 1871 to 75, the National Association was run by the players. Okay? They were professionals, they got paid, but they ran the show. In 1876, a man named William Holbert, who famously said he would rather be a lamppost in the city of Chicago than the mayor of New York City, decided that the players in the National Association were 1, too drunk, 2, too well paid, and 3, not disciplined enough. So he tempted 4 of the best players from the Boston club to come to Chicago and play for him. And he built a league around that team. He built a league around that team, and that was the beginning of the National League. The problem became the National League was beset by 2 things. One, drunkenness, which took a huge toll in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and gambling. The first Suspension for gambling happened in 1878. That was repeated in 1879. Between 1876 and 1880, there was at least one club a year that failed to finish its schedule, that went out of business. In 1881, that was the first year the entire league finished. Okay, so baseball is a very tenuous thing. Even though it was professional and even though these guys made money, it was, suffice it to say, not a very well thought of occupation. In 1882, the American Association formed and lasted until 1892. In 1884, the Union Association had play for 1 year. And in 1890, the Players League had play for 1 year. And then disappeared. Now notice, between 1893 and 1900, the National League was the only professional league in existence. And in that time period, if you, say, owned part of one team, you could own part of another team. And people took advantage of that. The Robinson brothers owned teams in Cleveland and St. Louis in 1899. And halfway through, or before the season started, they decided to trade, Lou Krieger, one of the best catchers in baseball, and some pitcher, you might have heard of him, named Cy Young. They traded him to Cleveland. Or they traded him to St. Louis, rather, from Cleveland, because they realized that St. Louis could make more money. So they traded them both to St. Louis. Cleveland then lost 120 of 144 games that year. They're the worst team in the history of professional baseball, the Cleveland Spiders. They were both owned by the same people. Now you might think that this might have ruined baseball. Yes, it might have, except for the creation of the American League. Now tonight I'm going to talk more about the American Association and the National League, because the American Association was started by a bunch of people that got thrown out of the National League in 1881. And this centers around the town of Cincinnati, Ohio. Now back in this time period, you had the National League, which held to 3 main items. 1, ticket prices, 50 cents. 50 cents. Okay. Now, of course, in those days, the average working man made about $2 to $2.50 a week. So 50 cents was a huge cost. Okay. Second, if you played in the National League, you did not, under any circumstances, play baseball on a Sunday. Not allowed. Third, and in God's name, you would never sell beer in a National League ballpark. So this does a multiple number of things. The National League owners, led by Hurlburt, and then the man who succeeded him after he died of a heart attack in 1882, named Abraham G. Mills, wanted them to be respectable. A middle class to upper class entertainment opportunity. Somewhere you could bring your wife, somewhere you could bring, if you wanted to, your young sons. And they would not be accosted, they would not be yelled at, they would not have beer poured on them, they wouldn't have bottles thrown at them, that kind of thing. There wouldn't be rowdies. In 1881, or in 1880 rather, the Cincinnati team, which is owned by a man named Justice Thorner and another man named O.P. Kaler, who was a very, let's say, witty sports writer. They got thrown out of the National League because they were renting out their ballpark for baseball on Sundays, and they were selling beer at games. So the National League threw them out. Now, Cincinnati was the site of the very first professional baseball team, recognized as professionals, the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. And they thought, we can't have professional baseball without having Cincinnati. Okay, this is why Cincinnati is the site of the opening day game for the major leagues. Now, so they got together, they met with a gentleman whose name was Hustling Horace Phillips from Philadelphia, and several other folks, and formed the American Association. And they sold tickets for 25 cents. They played ball on Sunday, and they sold beer. Okay. And the American Association comes to be called by the members of the National League the Beer and Whiskey League. Not because they sold beer, but because many of their owners own breweries and distilleries. But also, there's a little bit of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant anger towards this group. If you look at the guys' names who own these teams: Chris van der Ahe, Harry van der Horst, the ball players, Corcoran, Kelly, O'Neill. The majority of ball players at this time were Irish. The majority of owners in the American Association were German.
Oh, jeez.
So they didn't like him very much. And in 1882, when the American Association formed, they went to war with the National League. They tried to sign their players. They tried to open up with the season of teams in National League cities. And they wound up opening for play with teams in Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Baltimore, and Louisville. Okay. So it was very Midwest centered. And that Midwest was the site where many German and Irish immigrants wound up in the 1860s and 70s. Okay. Including yours truly. Okay. Now, after the 1883 season, the National League decided that they couldn't knock the American Association out of business. So they decided to make peace. And these two leagues came together and signed what came to be called the National Agreement. Now, how many of you have heard about the idea of the Oakland A's moving to San Jose? Okay. This is what keeps them from doing so. Okay. That idea of territoriality was in place in 1883. If there was a St. Louis team in the National League, which there was, the American Association had to get permission from the owners of the St. Louis National League team to start a team in St. Louis. And they had to pay a fee. Same thing in New York, same thing in Philadelphia, same thing in Washington, same thing in Baltimore. And this stabilized teams, because the American Association for several years, or two seasons anyway, really struggled to make inroads against the National League. The other important thing was the reserve clause. And this has incredible implications, not simply for baseball as a sport, but baseball is a business. Now, put this in perspective. Let's say, I don't know, Carrie over here comes into the city of Campbell and says, I need a job as your museum director, and they offer a 2-year contract at a set amount of money. And she goes, okay, that sounds good. So she signs a contract. Clause, I think 12 of that contract would read that she cannot negotiate at the end of that contract with any other museum in the state of California. Okay? Now, considering, maybe a year and a half later, she's in working and, she decides, I've had enough of this, no more school groups, no more nothing. I'm getting out of here. And she just walks out the door. And the city of Campbell doesn't fire her. They suspend her without pay. Now, the crux of this is that Carrie can't go and negotiate with any other museum in the state of California. But more than that, every other museum in the state of California agrees with the Campbell Museum and won't negotiate with Carrie. That's the essence of the reserve clause, that a player is bound to a team As Abraham Mills wrote to the owners of the Cleveland National League Club in 1884, when Fred Dunlop jumped to the Union Association, they wrote to A.G. Mills saying, "Can we negotiate with Dunlop? I mean, he signed a contract with the St. Louis team. Does that mean anything? Can we talk to him?" And A.G. Mills' response is, "It doesn't matter if he stays in St. Louis for 10 years. He's still reserved on your ball club." Meaning no one in the National League is going to talk to him. So if you get fined or thrown off the team for drunkenness or inefficiency, which was code for drunkenness, or how is it called? Inopportune play, drunkenness, they'd suspend you, but they wouldn't release you. So ball players were stuck in many instances. And the reserve clause at first was looked at as a great thing by ball players because they were guaranteed a job. You know, they knew they could come in the next spring or next summer and play. After about 10 years, they began to realize what exactly that meant. And that was they could never get away from it. So if you retired for 4 years, went off, let your arm heal or a injury heal, and came back, you had to go back to the team that you left 4 years beforehand. You could not go and negotiate with anyone else. Now, the reserve rule lasted until the 1970s. Okay? Even though it was found unconstitutional at least 6 times in between the 1890s and the 1970s with the Andy Messersmith case, which was found by Peter Seitz, an arbitrator, that he's a free agent. Okay, so while baseball salaries have absolutely skyrocketed since the 1970s, they would have done so long before had it not been for the reserve clause. Okay, and the interesting thing is that one man, a local guy, Charlie Finley, owner of the Oakland A's, Marvin Miller, who was the president of the Players Association in the 1970s, said that Charlie Finley almost ruined free agency. And he had a great idea, and that was make every player every year a free agent. Which, if the baseball owners were intelligent, which of course we know they're not, they would have, because it would keep salaries down. If Reggie Jackson is on the market with 25 or 30 other right fielders, that's one thing. If Reggie Jackson's on the market with 3 other people, there you go. So if the reserve clause maintained, but in 1884, someone came up and said that's wrong. And the players loved him for it. And that was Henry Van Noy Lucas. And this is the first season I'm going to talk about today, is the 1884 season. And Henry Van Noy Lucas was a wealthy man from St. Louis. His father was an investor in the Southern Pacific Railroad. His grandfather was one of the land speculators, and then was a commissioner set up by Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase. So he had a lot of money. And he wanted his own ball club. Now keep in mind, when 1884 rolls around, he's only 26 years old. And he starts his own league. And he starts with 8 teams. Now you may think that this is in danger because one of them is in, of all places, Altoona, Pennsylvania. The smallest city to ever host a so-called major league team. It lasted all of 3.5 to 4 weeks. They were outscored 112 to 29 in the games they played. One player from that team, Germany Smith, became a very good ball player in the 1890s. The rest of them disappeared. And he goes out, declares war on the reserve clause, and begins to sign players. And he signs players, in many cases, for his team, the St. Louis Maroons, which played in a ballpark built on his estate in St. Louis. And this was one of the main issues for the Union Association in 1884. The Maroons were too good. Imagine, if you will, a professional baseball team starting off winning 40 of their first 44 games. You'd have the St. Louis Maroons. They won 96 out of 119 games that year. And not just one, they beat people into submission. And Lucas liked it that way. He had the best team. Now, whether or not Lucas was trying to force his way into the National League, which is what he eventually got, I think he probably was. And there's a huge debate now whether or not the UA was a major league. Personally, I don't think it was at all. If you have a bar trivia question, the youngest man to ever play 100 games in the major league season, the answer, Mike Slattery from the 1884 Boston Unions. He didn't even turn 17 until the season was over.
Oh.
Okay. That's not a major league. Okay. More teenagers played in the Union Association than any other league in the history of baseball. But it caused really, really difficult problems. And the biggest thing was that this is the first year that you could literally, as David Nemec, a great 19th century historian, says, this is the first year you watch scoreboards because the telegraph was in operation. So you had scores coming into different ballparks. Ballparks put up scoreboards on their outfield fences. You could watch them. You could watch the scores come in. In 1884, the Union Association starts off. By the end of the season, you have teams that drop out. They also start off, when teams drop out, they bring up the St. Paul Saints, the first Major League Baseball team in the history of the state of Minnesota. They bring in the Milwaukee Brewers, the first Major League Baseball team in the history of Wisconsin. They also bring in the Wilmington Quicksteps from Delaware. Now, the Wilmington Quicksteps is a great example of how the national agreement worked, because the Wilmington Quicksteps, say that 3 times fast, was in the Eastern League. And when they were in the Eastern League, they were under the protection of the national agreement. So no other teams could sign their guys. But when they jumped to the Union Association, they were fair game. So when they did, 3 of their best players were gone within 7 days.
Whoa.
Of course, one of them had fallen down an elevator shaft while he was drunk, but let's not go there. The other 2 wound up in the National League. And the Wilmington Quicksteps, even though they won the Eastern League title that year, just got pounded. The St. Paul Saints are famous for one thing, and that is they are the only team in Major League Baseball history to never play a home game.
Oh.
They stepped in and played out the rest of the schedule for another team, and were always on the road. Okay. Now, in the National League in 1884, the Union Association had a huge impact on what happened. So cast your minds back, if you will, to July 22nd, 1884. A man named Mike Sweeney, who was actually from San Francisco, starts a game for the Providence Grays of the National League, and he pitches terribly. Sweeney throws very hard, but he's wild. He's throwing the ball all over the place. When he gets it over the plate, people are hitting it a mile. His manager comes out and says, all right, this is what it's going to be. You're going out to right field, because in those days, a lot of pitchers, when they weren't pitching, played in the field. They were actually ball players. Not like they are in the American League, where we have some obscene invention called the designated hitter. Sorry, I'm a little biased on that regard. But Sweeney looked at him and said, I'm not going to right field. Manager again said, no, you're going to right field. He said, the hell with you. Verbally abused the manager, as the newspaper said, threw the ball down, kicked it out into right field, and then walked off. Well, 1, Sweeney was drunk. 2, a week later, he wound up in the uniform of the St. Louis Maroons of the Union Association. There's a very good chance he did it on purpose, so he would get out of his contract with Providence. Because St. Louis offered him about $1,500 more to pitch for them. And he wound up pitching very well. He wound up winning 24 games for him. Now, of course, the interesting thing about Sweeney is he wound up actually dying in prison at San Quentin. He killed someone in a bar fight in San Francisco. There is some goodly amount of research that maintains that it was in self-defense. It probably was. But Sweeney was not a very good character. But what this meant was it left Providence with basically 2 pitchers. Because in those days, if you went out and pitched, you went out and pitched 1 for 9 innings. And chances are you pitched almost every day. Because this is, again, one of those times of change. In the early 1880s, teams played 75 to 85 games a year. And they only had 1 pitcher. Because, in many cases, you're throwing underhand. You're not, putting a lot of strain on your arm. There's some. People aren't hitting home runs all the time. So you can get away with having a guy pitch 60, 70 games. By the middle part of the 1880s, some teams, like the White Stockings and the Browns, are experimenting with 2 and sometimes 3 men pitching rotations. What this meant was, when the Providence team kicked Sweeney off, they had 2 pitchers left. One of them was 22 years old and had not pitched very much in the major leagues. The other was a guy named Charlie Radbourn, who was all of about 5'9", weighed about 195 pounds, and he had the great nickname of Old Hoss. Okay. And Old Hoss Radbourn comes down and says this, that I'll pitch every day and win the pennant for Providence, even if it costs me my right arm. And lo and behold, his owners did the following. They struck the reserve clause from his contract, meaning he could actually be a free agent at the end of the year. They also paid him like 2 pitchers. Every game he started for Sweeney, he got the money that was meant for Sweeney. And they also gave him probably $1,000 payoff right at the start. And what happened is a record that will absolutely, positively, 100% never be broken. And that is this. Of the remaining 51 games for Providence, Radbourn started 41 of them. And he won 35. He won 59 games in 1884. We will never see anything close to that ever again. He threw 585 innings. Pitchers now struggle to throw 200 in a season. He threw 585. He won 18 consecutive games from August 7th to September 6th. He started every game but 1 between August 9th and September 24th. And he won 24 out of the 28. And the 2 of the 4 that he lost were at the very end, because when he got up in the morning, he couldn't lift his arm over his waist, basically. What he had to do was, he had to get rub downs from, and one historian writes, he got rub downs from his roommate, his manager, some cases the bellhops at the hotel, anyone who was available. He had a special warm-up thing that he devised. He would come up and stand this close to someone and literally do this. And then move back about to 10 or 15 feet. And it took him a half hour to get out to the outfield, and then he was throwing overhand so his arm would work. And at one point, he was the best pitcher in baseball. He was the best pitcher in baseball in 1883. But no one is ever going to come close to Hoss Radbourn. So when you read in some cases in the early 1900s, you read now about how players didn't play well when we were younger, and in my day, people played hard. That's been going on since the early 1900s. Most people who are complaining about the players in the early 1900s are talking about Hoss Radbourn going out and pitching every single day for a month and a half. In the American Association, the team that won the pennant was the New York Metropolitans. And the owner of that team was a man named John Day, who was so cheap that the New York Mets would actually go out and ransack the other team's equipment bags before games to steal their bats. They played on a place in New York that was actually called the Dump. Why? Because it used to be a city dump. The Mets were not expected to do anything, and they wound up winning the American Association pennant. And they scored off against Providence in what became the first World Series. Now, in those days, it was called the World's Series, WORLD''S. And this 1884 series, Providence Grays won the pennant by about 10 games, and the owners had to come together to agree to play a series because it was not officially sanctioned by either league. So this was the pattern. If you wanted to play a postseason series against someone else at this time period, the owner of the ball club had to do it. It wasn't the league. And in this case, they put up $1,000 each. The prize money was held by a newspaper called the Brooklyn Clipper, and they went and played. They played 3 games, all of which at the New York ballpark, which by that time had changed to a place called the Polo Grounds, which in those days, since John Day also owned the National League New York club, he would only allow the Mets to play there if there wasn't a National League game. And, the National League game also, if they're later on in the 1890s, there was actually a curtain or separator that they put up between the two fields. And occasionally a ball from the other field would come flying through there into the other game. But John Day actually, after the season was over, he transferred Jim Murtry and the 2 best players from the Mets over to the New York National League team, the Giants. Because you could do that. If you own both teams, put them over here. They get a better chance of winning. But they sign up for this series. They play in New York. They play under American Association rules. And Providence is expected to win. Of course they do. And who wins all 3 games? Hoss Rapp won. He gives up 3 runs, none earned, in 22 innings. Probably the best World Series performance for my money is in 1905, and Christy Mathewson threw 3 shutouts, 3 complete game shutouts, 27 innings, no runs, and beat the Philadelphia Athletics almost single-handedly. But Hoss was good. After that, after the season, he was never the same. He was good for a few more years. Then his arm gave out. He wound up operating a saloon and billiard hall, and wound up being a very, very well thought of gentleman within his city. He actually got a very good funeral from the town. About 3,000 people showed up. So he was well loved and well respected. He just wasn't the same player after he had done that. Now he made a lot of money from that time. The average salary here is about $1,700. Most historians think that Radbourne made $7,000 or $8,000 for that season alone. So, but he earned it. You don't put yourself on the line like that. And he came out and said, I'm going to win the pennant for Providence, and by God, he did. But the precedent for the World Series was set in 1884, because after that, the Union Association completely dissolved. Actually, one interesting thing about the Union Association, they had the league meeting in 1885. The owners that showed up and voted that they weren't going to play that year weren't in the league when it started. So St. Louis, or not St. Louis, but St. Paul, Milwaukee, and actually a team in, I believe, Peoria, Illinois showed up. And they voted the Union League out of existence. Because by that time, Lucas had got his National League team, which was called the Black Diamonds, because 4 of his players were blacklisted because they had played in the Union Association. He bought them forgiveness. He himself said that he spent $60,000 to $70,000 in 1884 and 1885 on his team. That's close to at least $2 to $3 million now, which but even at that point, it's an astronomical sum. Lucas did not last in baseball. He was run out of the National League by the early 1890s and actually wound up penniless. He was working as an insurance salesman in St. Louis when he died in the early 1900s. He's a very strange person in baseball, because is he a villain, is he a hero, who knows? But one of his players, Pebbly Jack Glasscock, said in the 1930s they were doing a history for the Hall of Fame. He said, that man was a millionaire and he dressed great, but he loved the players. Actually, he called him a dude. And in that day and age, a dude meant you dressed to the nines. Diamond stick pins, spats, the whole 9 yards. He was a millionaire and a dude, but he loved his players. He actually bought them satin uniforms.
Wow.
But, importantly, the precedent for World Series is set. And another St. Louis team begins to take the spotlight here. And this team is the St. Louis Browns, which the St. Louis Browns were probably the best team in the American Association. They won pennants for 4 straight seasons. They finished second one other time and third in another season. This is their owner, Chris von der Ahe, who called himself Der Boss President. He was a German immigrant that moved here from Westphalia in the 1860s and opened himself up a brewery, and then began to notice, before the St. Louis Ball Club was shut down in the National League, that people drank a lot of beer when there was a ball game. And he thought, that's a good deal. I should get in on this. So in 1882, he and a man named Alfred Spink, who actually wound up to go on to found the Sporting News, got together to buy an American Association team. And they bought a team called the St. Louis Browns, called the Browns because they had brown stockings. Okay. And notice 25-cent admission fee, beer concession and whatnot, which was run by Van der Ahe. That was very popular. But more importantly, Van der Ahe had a very good eye for talent. At least he did at this point. Now later on, that might become a little shady. Now, he is noted for being kind of a clown in baseball circles. At one point in 1884, after he had built his ballpark, he invited all the American Association owners to come out for opening day. They show up, he stands there, and he stands at the middle of his ballpark in the pitcher's box and says, I have the biggest infield in the Welt. And one of his players says, all the infields are the same size. He goes, well, then I have the biggest diamond in the Welt. He played the buffoon for the cameras, but he was, for the press, but he was very, very sharp. And he not only owned a beer concession, he owned multiple apartment buildings in St. Louis, which he named for his players. You could live at the Gleason, you could live at the Fouts, you could live at the Latham, if you will. Okay? So he loved his players up to a point, okay? Because he was also fairly greedy, but he wasn't unlike any other owner in the 1880s. And Van der Ahe, one man, O.P. Kaler, who lived in Cincinnati, was that great sports writer, said this about Van der Ahe, that there was no middle ground with him. You either despised him or you hated him. And Van der Ahe would sit behind the third base line, wear these brightly checkered suits. Even for that point, even for that time, they were gaudy. He would sit there wearing these checkered suits and a bowler hat, and he would have binoculars. He would carry a whistle, and whenever he wanted anything, he would whistle, meaning he wanted to talk to one of the players, he wanted to order beer from one of the people bringing beer around, or he wanted to yell at someone, usually an umpire. Now keep in mind in those days that the parks, the baseball parks were set up in that you didn't have dugouts. The players sat on benches that were literally within touching distance of the fans, because the parks would only have 10 to 12,000 people in them. They were all made out of wood, they were very uncomfortable, and what would happen is they'd get showered with stuff. They get beer thrown at them, popcorn, goodness knows what else. This went on until the 1930s. One of the great quotes about that is Ducky Medwick, the only player to get pulled off the field for his own safety in the World Series. He spiked a guy during a game, and then the next inning, fans just pelted him with all sorts of stuff. Rotten garbage, rotten fruit, beer bottles. And Commissioner Landis pulled him off the field. And they asked him, Ducky, what happened? And he said, well, the question I had is, why in the hell would anybody bring all that stuff to a ball game in the first place? But, you know, Van der Ahe encouraged that kind of behavior. When you got a fine, he'd pay it. When after an umpire got fined $10, he'd pay it. Anything for mine boys, he would say. He encouraged that. And he had very, very good players. Now, of course, his ballpark, which is right here, this building was actually a beer garden. A two-story house that he had built into a saloon. It was in play. So if the ball went rolling in there, the outfielder could run through the tables and pick up the ball and throw it back into play. Now you don't see this on the thing, but he put down a cinder track so you could have races around it with bicycles or you know, people just running. He had a petting zoo out there for a couple years. The first year it was open, he actually imported Chinese fireworks, which are actually small motors, that he set off and actually injured several fans because they exploded. He had water chutes. You could ride down, you know, and splash into a pond that was out where about that kind of coach is on the top there. And in the winter that froze over, and he sold ice skating concessions. Okay, so yeah, absolutely he was, and he sold beer throughout this because his saloon was right down here. The Golden Lion Saloon. And who made the beer that was sold there? Van der Ahe did. And where did the Browns meet before the team meet before the game? At the Golden Lion Saloon. Where did they march to after the game? The Golden Lion Saloon. It's the equivalent of, say, the San Francisco Giants walking up the street to go to the 21st Amendment Brewery. And they did it every game. Van der Ahe was a genius for business. He was absolutely terrible as it went for baseball, at least running his own team. But one thing that he understood, and that was the German-American population of St. Louis needed this. And the National League was not providing. Okay. So he targeted, in some cases, a working class clientele. He also is one of the people credited with developing the idea of ladies' days. Now, whether or not it's true or not, I think there are other people doing it at the same time, but in the mid-1880s, it was thought that if you bring women to a ball game, that it would act as a calming influence on the men. That we would be less likely to act like boobs and act like civilized people. Now, that probably never happened, but, you know, the idea was there. He wasn't, you know, so this ballpark becomes known as the Coney Island of the West. It burned down in the 1890s. The ballparks then, of course, were made from wood. Fire was a constant danger. It was actually struck by lightning and burned down. And when that happened, Van der Ahe lost all of his trophies. He lost all of his memorabilia, and that was one of the things that drove him out of baseball in the 1890s, because the insurance wouldn't cover it. Right. So, look at this. Now they used to do this. I wish they would still with baseball teams. They used to make things called cabinets, which were pictures that you could mount in cabinets in your home, and you could look in there and see the best players of the game. So in the middle here, you have Chris Van der Ahe, that's him, surrounded by his St. Louis Browns American Association 1886 champions. Okay. And notice the hats. Big stripes. Okay. And his team was filled with characters. Now, if you've heard the name Charlie Comiskey, most well known for being the owner of the Chicago White Sox, and the owner for the Black Sox team that threw the World Series in 1919 because he was so cheap. He was Van der Ahe's first baseman and manager. Charlie Comiskey was a great first baseman. He is the one that is credited for inventing the idea that the pitcher come over and cover first base when there's a ground ball to the right side of the infield. People didn't do that before. He was one of the first basemen to play off the bag. In the early 1880s, guys played literally sometimes standing on the bag. First base, second base, and third base. Comiskey moved a few steps off. He also developed the idea of a cutoff. When a ball was hit in the right field, Comiskey would run out, past second base, catch the ball, and then relay the throw. He was one of the first players to do that as well. So he was constantly thinking about how to make a play better. He was constantly thinking about how to make his team better. Now, Comiskey was a very no-nonsense guy, but he wasn't above some chicanery, let's say. He was an aggressive ball player, but certainly not as aggressive as some of his other players were. Now, his two pitchers, Bob Carruthers and Dave Fouts, were nicknamed Parisian Bob and Scissors. Fouts was nicknamed Scissors because of the way he pitched. He was, in one way, all knees and elbows, if you will. He would tie himself up in knots, he would turn himself sideways, and then throw up, and he was very, very good. He threw a great drop ball, which was at that point a curveball. Bob Carruthers was called Parisian Bob because after 1885, he held out. He wanted more money. And when Van der Ahe telegraphed him saying, "You better sign this contract," he replied by saying no. Well, the papers noticed that the telegraph that he sent back was from Paris because he was there on vacation. So his nickname from then on was Parisian Bob. Parisian Bob was not only a good pitcher, but he could hit. When he wasn't pitching, he played in the outfield. If Madison Bumgarner is the best hitting pitcher now, which he is, Carruthers is better. Over 3 seasons, Carruthers stole 80 bases. He hit .295. He hit 10 home runs over 3 years. He was good enough, actually, when his arm gave out, he played outfield in Brooklyn. So these guys played both ways. With Carruthers and Fouts, you had 2 of the best pitchers in baseball on the same team, and then there's Arlie Latham. Latham was infamous. His own teammates hated him. He actually had a list at the end of the 1886 season of fights that he was scheduled to have. There were 26.
Oh my God.
8 of them were his own teammates because they were tired of listening to him talk. During the 1887 World Series, or 1886 World Series, he's actually forced to move behind the plate and catch. And one of the newspapermen said that it was the best thing that happened. The home crowd cheered because they wouldn't have to listen to Arlie Latham coach anymore. And Latham was, at the time that the word fresh meant that you were obstreperous, you were obnoxious, and you generally caused trouble, Arlie Latham's nickname was the freshest man on earth. And he is the reason we have third base coaching boxes. Because before this, at this time, Latham would stand there when the other team's pitcher was getting ready to pitch, he would stand there and he'd do this kind of thing. And the guy brought his hands up, he'd start yelling, "You bum, you stink! God, you're terrible!" Of course, he'd use words far worse than that. And he would continue this on throughout the time the guy's throwing the ball. Guy hit a ground ball to third base, he'd stand there 3 feet from him and go, "Oh, you're gonna miss that! You're terrible! You couldn't hit one or if you fell out of a boat!" That kind of stuff. And he did it constantly. But that was acceptable in the 1880s. That was what was called coaching. And the best players, like Latham, did it constantly, every game. Latham was also a kind of a dude in some stuff. At one point he said, one historian writes, "Arley took full advantage of any rule by running up and down the third baseline, yelling invectives at the pitcher in the middle of his windup." He is also the first permanent first base coach in Major League history. He was also hired by the New York Giants under another very, very good fighter, John McGraw, to be one of his coaches in the 1900s. And he outlived all his teammates. He died in 1952. He was 94. But he was a very good ball player. He ran very well. He played a good third base. But as Van der Ahe routinely said, that Latham's will drive me crazy. He was divorced twice. He was brought up on charges multiple times for public drunkenness, for violence, for beating his kids and his wife. He was not a very pleasant gentleman. But he's the first third baseman to play in 1,500 games in the history of the major leagues, and he remains still the oldest man to ever steal a base in a Major League Baseball game. He came in as a pinch runner when he was 49 years old and stole a base when he was playing with the Giants. Now, this was just part of the group that they had. And the Browns, imagine, if you will, going to St. Louis to play. You're a visiting team. You're out there pitching. You have Latham screaming at you from one side. If Comiskey's waiting to hit, he's yelling things too. You have Van der Ahe sitting behind the third base bag, blowing into his whistle constantly, waving around a cane. You have fans who, in the words of the Chicago Tribune, were the lowest parts of humanity, throwing beer bottles, yelling things, and you can imagine why the Browns won 3/4 of their home games for 8 years. People hated playing there because they were so evil in many ways. It was a rough game in the 1880s. It wasn't as bad as the 1890s, believe it or not. As Bill James writes, if the game in the 1880s was rough, the game in the 1890s was criminal. And he's right. These guys were rough, and they made no excuses for it, but they were also damn good. So in 1885 and 1886, the Browns come to the fore, and they win the first 2 of their 4 consecutive American Association titles. And they wound up playing the Chicago White Stockings. Now, the White Stockings kind of, prided themselves on being decent folks, which is nonsense. Now, they were every bit as chicanerous, every bit as loud, every bit as frisky as the Browns were, except they had a man named Albert Goodwill Spaulding running their team. Yes, that Spaulding, who owned the Spaulding Sporting Goods Empire. Okay? He was a former pitcher for the Boston team and was what was called a magnate at the time. His first baseman and manager was Cap Anson, called Pops, and he was the first man to have 3,000 hits in a career. So Anson was also instrumental in putting up the color line in 1885. He also had a man named King Kelly. King Kelly had a song written about him in the 1880s called Slide Kelly Slide. He played catcher, he played first base, he played outfield, he played third base. He was good at all of them. He also was in a position that sometimes, since there was only one umpire on the field in the 1880s, when he would hit a ball out in the outfield and it rolled to the fence, he would run to first base, and if the umpire had his back turned, he would cut off at first base and run directly across the diamond to third. He also made a play once when a man popped up. This is why they have the substitution rules that they do right now. When there was a pop-up toward the Chicago bench, ball's coming out the players. Kelly jumps up, yells, "Kelly not catching for Chicago!" Catches the ball for the out. Throws the ball back into the field.
Oh my God.
He also, Spalding and Anson regularly hired detectives to follow this guy. Once, Spalding called him into his office and said, "All right, Kelly, I did on good authority you were drinking lemonade in an establishment of ill repute at 3 in the morning. Kelly's response was, "Lemonade, hell! I've never drank lemonade at 3 a.m. in my life. That was straight whiskey." He was a great player, but again, just a ne'er-do-well. A lot of these guys were. And Anson, it drove him crazy. He was a teetotaler. He didn't like to drink. He also one great bit, in the 1880s and 90s, a lot of ball players, up until the early parts of the 20th century, actually appeared on vaudeville. Because they were famous, they would get them in there to do lines, whatnot. Someone said Anson acted like a first baseman. That wasn't meant to be a compliment. So in 1885, these two teams got together, and they played in the World Series, and the 1885 series wound up being disputed. Because in Game 2, Game 1 ended in a tie after the 6th inning because it was darkness. When people say baseball doesn't have a clock, they're wrong. It's called the sun. And back in those days, games started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They regularly went an hour and a half to 2 hours, and they were done by 5. If they went later than that, they risked being called because of darkness. And in Game 1 of the 1885 World Series, they called it after the 6th inning because it was dark. It's a tie. It became a tie game. Game 2 had all sorts of craziness, and that was this. Chicago's Ned Williamson comes up, swings, taps the ball down the first baseline, and a voice yelled, "Foul ball!" Then the ball went back into fair territory. Okay. Now, Sullivan, who was the umpire, claimed that Cap Anson had called foul ball from the Chicago bench. Okay. And then he sent Ned Williamson, the batter, to first base because the ball went back into fair territory before it got to the first base bag. So it should have been a fair ball. Charlie Comiskey, the first baseman, said, "Nope, we're not going to play the rest of this game." He pulled the Browns off the field and said, "Nope, we're not going to play. That's it." And 4.5 hours later, from the safety of a hotel room in St. Louis, umpire Sullivan ruled that because the Browns had left the field, they forfeited the game to Chicago. He actually had to have a police escort out of town. And St. Louis won the next 2 games, and then Spalding and Van der Ahe decided to play Game 7 winner take all for $2,000. The Browns came out and stomped the White Stockings 13-4. But Spalding, along with his Francis Richter, a great writer, and editor of the baseball magazine The Sporting Life, said, "Nope, sorry, you won 3 games, we won 3 because of the forfeit. Nobody gets any money." And that's where it stayed. The owners kept all the gates, the players got nothing. So when 1886 rolled around, And the Browns again win the American Association pennant, and the White Stockings win the National League pennant. There's some hard feelings there. Spalding and Van der Ahe hated each other. I mean, with a true white-hot passion. And to be honest, a lot of the ball players didn't like each other very much either, because the Browns thought they got rooked the previous year, and the White Stockings thought, you guys aren't any good, we'll beat you again. So it was on, as they say. And this was the first World Series in 1886 to be a full-on best-of-7 affair. And it was winner take all. The winning team would keep all the gate receipts from the games. That came out to close to $15,000. I mean, it sounded like a lot, but 1886, that's a lot of money. Okay. And Chicago was a team that, unlike the Browns ran very well, they pitched very well, and they fielded very well. The listen to me, the White Stockings basically clubbed people into submission. They were the first National League team to score 900 runs in a single season, and that's in 126 games. On average, they scored 3.5 more runs than the other team did. So this team could score. They played the first 3 games in Chicago at what was called the West Side Grounds. And if you remember the Polo Grounds from where the Giants used to play in New York, it's long and shaped like a bathtub. And you got the big horseshoe grandstand. That's the same format that the West Side Grounds had. So very, very short down the lines, and very, very, very long in center field, about 575 feet, as it were. Pac-Bell, I think, is, or AT&T Park, I think, is 420 in the notch there, maybe 425. So a good 100 feet beyond that. Game 1, the White Sox start John Clarkson, their best pitcher, and he goes out against Carruthers, or not Carruthers, but Fouts, and Clarkson wins very easily. He throws a 6-0 shutout. And the Chicago crowd was vicious. Several people got thrown out of the ballpark. They threw garbage at the St. Louis Browns players. When both teams rode to the park in carts, pulled by white horses with a marching band in front. The Browns cart was pelted with garbage all the way down. And when they got to the field, they got beat. And the crowd was so good that the receipts from that game alone were $2,000. Game 2 was the next day. Bob Carruthers, Parisian Bob, comes out, and he doesn't allow a hit for 5 innings. Then in the 6th inning, there's a near fight. It's Jim McCormick, Cubs pitcher, is running back to cover home plate, and Kurt Welch runs by him. And as McCormick turns around, he inadvertently hits Welch. Just kind of turns like this and hits him. Welch gets angry, balls up his fist, and jumps and hits McCormick right in the back. And McCormick starts going after him. So there's going to be a fight. Cooler heads prevailed, though. Even the Chicago fans hissed at McCormick because they thought that he had gone after him unnecessarily. But nobody could hit Carruthers that day. The Chicago Tribune, in writing of Arthur Latham, wrote that such coarse behavior may be acceptable in St. Louis, but it is not in Chicago. They said that he swore terribly. He has a mouth that's awful. He was the one person that the crowd hated, and they just got on it. And after Carruthers had pitched so well, he went to Van der Ahe that night and begged him to start him in Game 3. He's like, "I can get these guys. I can do it. I got him. I know what's going on here." Van der Ahe, against his better judgment, says, "Okay, all right, Parisian Bob, you go out there the next day and you pitch again." And he comes out and just gets pounded. He doesn't have anything. The Browns lose 11-4. And King Kelly hits a home run in the 6th. Latham is moved to catcher, and this is when the crowd applauds because they can't hear him talk anymore. So that, when he puts on what comes to be called the tools of ignorance, they were using catcher's mitts at that time and a very rudimentary chest protector and mask. They can't hear him, so they're happy. And the series then shifts to St. Louis, which is a 8-hour train ride away. So they go down to St. Louis for games 4 to 6. And Chicago has a 2-1 lead. The bettors are favoring the White Sox. They're just throwing money down on them. And something strange begins to happen. 10,000 people show up for game 4. The outfield is actually roped off. So if you can imagine, say, like an AT&T Park, the stands are overflowing because there weren't any bleachers in those days. So what they did was they just put people in the outfield and they roped the outfield off. So of course, what would happen is if a ball went flying into the outfield, or into the stands, one of the ground rules was it would be a ground rule double. Now, of course, if you were a Browns fan and a Chicago player hit the ball out there, you grab the rope and start doing this. And pulling it back, so there would be more room. If and if the Brown did it, you push forward like this to try to get the ball. That's a pretty normal thing. And Chicago scored 3 runs in the first, and then Tip O'Neill, who was the Browns' best hitter, started off a rally and wound up getting the first intentional walk the next inning in World Series history. He got 2 more during the game. And they were tied 4-4 in the 6th, and then the Browns scored 3 runs in the 8th before the game was called due to darkness and wound up winning 8-5. The Tribune, though, said that the White Sox were, quote, strangely undisturbed by losing this game. And the word that they used was hippodroming, meaning they were throwing games to make the purse bigger. This is a very common complaint in 19th century baseball. It was very common in the 1870s. Now, whether or not the White Sox are doing this, I don't know. Personally, I don't think they were. I think they got beat on the up and up in that game. In game 5, Chicago again gets beat 10-3, and they played very, very badly. They made errors. They didn't hit well. So I think maybe there's a little bit of that going on. And this is given credence by the fact that Cap Anson, instead of starting a guy named Jocko Flynn, who was his 3rd best pitcher, he started as shortstop Ned Williamson at pitcher. That may sound strange, but that was kind of normal in those days. Williamson did pitch a few games for Chicago, but he wasn't very good. So whether or not Anson felt something and said, okay, I'm starting Williamson, or whether or not he hippodromed a little, I don't know. But that set up game 6. And Spalding and Van der Ahe agreed to start the game an hour earlier so there wouldn't be any question of darkness ending it. Van der Ahe wanted that because if the Browns won the game, they'd win the World Championship. So he's like, yeah, I don't want to risk anything here. Okay. And John Clarkson started for the White Stockings. He didn't allow a hit until the 7th inning. He just mowed people down. People said his drop ball was outstanding. No one could hit it. And the White Stockings held a 2-0 lead in the 8th. And then strange things began to happen. Charlie Comiskey came up and hit a single. Kurt Welch got on an error by 3rd baseman Tom Burns. Burns ran in, picked up the ball, threw it over Cap Anson's head. And the Browns scored in a sacrifice fly, and then it was 2-1. 2 batters later, there's 2 guys on. And Arlie Latham comes up, puts his bat down, turns around, looks at the grandstand, and says, "Don't worry, folks, I'll tie her up." Picks the bat up on the first pitch, hits a ball into right field, and ties the score 2-2. Now, this is a great Babe Ruth moment, which is matched only by a man named Germany Schaefer, who in the early 1900s, I think 1906, was playing for Detroit. He came up, doffed his hat to the people at the park in Detroit and said, "Gentlemen and ladies, my name is Germany Schaefer. And now I will proceed to hit a home run because I am the best ball player in the world." And lo and behold, he did it. It's actually written up in newspapers. The man did this. I don't know what was going on. Maybe he worked it out with the pitcher beforehand. But, so the game's tied going in at 3-all, the 9th, uneventful. In the 10th, the first batter for the Browns is Kurt Welch. He gets hit by a pitch. Now, up until 3 years before this, you could do that. It was a ball. One of the new rules was you get hit by a pitch, you get to take first base. So Welch goes down to first. And in the meantime, Cap Anson starts yelling and screaming. He never made an attempt to get out of the way of the ball. You can't let him do that. He just stood there and got hit by the ball. That's illegal. You can't do that. The umpire agrees with Anson and sends Welch back to hit again. The crowd's booing. They're throwing stuff. They're screaming. Welch just kind of shrugs like this, and the next pitch he hits a single into center field. So he's on first base anyway. Okay. Dave Fouts comes up, and he hits a dribbler down to shortstop. Everybody's safe because nobody can get the ball. So there's runners at first and second, there's nobody out. Yank Robinson, who's a very, very good second baseman for the Browns, comes up and he bunts the guys over to second and third. So there's one out, runners at second and third. Doc Bushong, who was the Browns catcher, comes up. And as he puts one foot down by the plate, the White Stockings pitcher quick pitches him. So he pitches him before he's set. Clarkson watches Bushong, he puts his foot down, Clarkson throws the ball. And the ball goes 4.5 feet over the White Sox catcher's head. Welch, who's on third, starts running, and rumor has it that when he got close to the plate, he threw his hands in the air and slid across home plate even though he didn't need to. So this comes to be known as the $15,000 slide, because that's how much the Browns won when they won the game. It's the single most famous play in 19th century baseball. And it is the only time that the American Association would win an undisputed world championship. Each member of the Browns got $580, which represented roughly 30% of their annual salary. Van der Ahe paid off his entire 45% of his payroll with that 6-game series. And that sets the stage for the next year, the last World Series we're going to talk about, 1987. Spalding was so angry that rumor had it he didn't even pay for the White Stockings train tickets home to Chicago. Now in 1887, the Browns played these gentlemen, Detroit. Now this will give you an idea of like one of the more grandiose ballparks. This is the South Park grounds in Boston. It's double tiered, it has the turrets, it's all wood. That had the capacity to seat about 7,000 fans. And these are the Detroit Wolverines. They are owned by a gentleman named Frederick Stearns, who owned a pharmaceutical company. And he challenged Van der Ahe to not a 7-game series, but a 15-game series. And Van der Ahe instantly thought, if I made that much during a 7-game series, goodness knows how much I'm going to make for a 15-game series. Let's do this. So he said yes. Okay? And the World Championship meant this, that the players would get roughly $100 per man if they won. Stearns said, if you beat those guys, I'll only give you $100. I'll give you $400 a hit each. Okay. So Detroit had a lot of motivation here. And the Browns, this is one of their more powerful teams. Tip O'Neill hit .435 that year. No one in the major leagues has hit 400 since Ted Williams hit .406 in 1941. Now, of course, in those days, sometimes balls were counted as, or walks were counted as hits. But even if you take that away, Tip O'Neill hit .410. This is the second year in a row he hit 400. And And Tip O'Neill hit in such a way where he would hold a bat like this, halfway up the thing, and he was called Tip O'Neill because he would tip the ball. He literally tried to punch it into the outfield. He wouldn't swing from his heels. A lot of guys did this. He'd punch it or tip it out in the outfield and get a hit. And then it'd be off to the races. He hit for the cycle twice that year. The Browns had, again, Carruthers and Fouts, the best pitchers of baseball. They also had a 19-year-old named Silver King who came up and won 7 games. Silver King is impressive because he is one of 4 pitchers to win 200 games before his 30th birthday. He never won another one. Partly because he won 45 games in 1889 and his arm was never the same. Now back in those days, they used these guys. Now of course they couldn't go and play for anyone else. So there you go. Game 1, October 10th, 1887. Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. It's raining, it's cold. And Carruthers throws a 1-0 shutout over a man named Pretzels Gietzen, who was starting for Detroit. He was called Pretzels because when he threw, he literally curled himself up into a ball and then threw the ball. So it was called Pretzels. And there's an overflow crowd from the next day on October 11th at Sportsman's Park. Detroit wins 5-3, but before the game, Jack Boyle, the St. Louis catcher, gets a gold watch and chain from the crowd because of his great work behind the plate. He was the first man, one of the second catcher actually, to catch more than 100 games in the season. Which, if you're thinking about it, he's sitting there 50 feet away from a man throwing as hard as he possibly can, wearing a catcher's mitt that isn't the big pillow, but sometimes is a small fielder's mitt with the fingertips cut out with a piece of meat in it. Catcher's mitts were used, but they weren't used extensively at this point. He did have a chest protector, but was probably like a leather vest. He wound up catching 100 games. If you ever get a chance, Google catcher's hands, and you'll see what that would do to these guys. I mean, their fingers are going like every which way. They look like hamburger. I mean, it's terrible. But he got a gold watch and chain from the crowd, which is not uncommon for players of that time to get those kind of gifts. So it's tied 1-1 on October 11th. After that game, imagine this. After that game, you play 2 games in 2 days. You then get on a train and take a 13-hour ride up to Detroit to play the next day.
Wow.
Okay. And you get there, and you realize that Miss Helen Devereux, a noted actress and wife of one man named John Montgomery Ward, not that Montgomery Ward, but the shortstop for the New York Giants, has bought from Tiffany's a silver loving cup about this tall to be given to the winner of the World Series, the Devereux Cup, which disappeared about 100 years ago. And it's on display at home plate. Might I also say that this is the last year that home plate was actually a rock. Home plate before 1888 was a stone that was buried in the ground until players started getting injured trying to slide over it.
Right.
And then a man named Kettering, who was a baseball player, developed the plate we know today. White rubber sheet, basically with the black outline. So it wasn't until 1888, 1889 that started to be used. We've used the same thing ever since. But before that, it was a rock. Back during the Union Association days, the Union League, the Union Association Cincinnati team bought out the lease on the American Association Cincinnati team for their ballpark. They came in and bought them out where they weren't looking. So the Cincinnati American Association practiced what they called scorched earth. They went in, tore down the entire stadium, fences, grandstand. They even went as far as to dig up the rock and left a hole at the home plate. Crazy, crazy stuff. But in any event, they have this on display. And the clubs, again, ride out. They have a big parade for Game 3 in Detroit. So after 13 hours on the train, you go to the hotel. You get up maybe 3 or 4 hours later. You're put on a cart in uniform and ride out to the game, cheered, bands playing, and the game went 13 innings.
Wow.
And it was the Browns lost on an error by Yank Robinson. Now the interesting thing is, even though this series is supposed to go 15 games, it was also in different cities. It was a traveling World Series. So they played in St. Louis, they played in Detroit. Now they're going to play in Pittsburgh. So at 8:30 that night, they get on another train and they go to Pittsburgh. And on the way there, Kurt Welch and Yank Robinson got drunk during a poker game on the train and got in a fist fight. So Welch got off the train, and he actually had black eyes. He'd been thumped pretty bad. And it was this that St. Louis Browns fans were like, our team is staying up getting drunk and playing poker till all hours. They should be getting ready for a baseball game. Well, of course, nobody really complains that they're traveling 13 hours to play a game in Pittsburgh. Of course. And Detroit comes out and they win on the strength of the pitching of a man named Lady Baldwin. He was called Lady because he did not smoke, drink, or cuss. So, Lady Baldwin. Lady Baldwin showed about 8-0. The next game was in Brooklyn. 2 days later, it was cold, about 35 or 40 degrees. The players had to wear long flannels. From there, they played across the river at the Polo Grounds. Detroit won that 9-0. Then, because Van der Ahe wanted to make some money, October 16th was an off day. He scheduled an exhibition game against Brooklyn, just to make an extra couple of dollars. And then on October 17th, they played in Philadelphia. Detroit wins again. They've won 5 out of 7 games. Game 8, it's in Boston. And they play at this field that is described by the own Boston newspapers as decrepit. And it hadn't been used for a Major League Baseball game since 1884. Okay? It's raining. The Browns get beat again. Latham sounds off to the newspaper saying, we're a regular custard pudding. We aren't ball players, we're chumps. But the series goes on. Game 9, Philadelphia. Detroit wins. They have a 7-2 lead in the series. And they get on a train at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to Washington. Game 10, St. Louis wins 11-4. But that wasn't the only game that day, because they had first game was in Washington. The second game of the doubleheader that day was in Baltimore, because they realized it was getting colder and colder and colder, and they had to get these games in.
Insane.
Okay, so they go to Baltimore, and the Browns, probably because they're up till God knows when in the morning drinking and playing poker, make 13 errors in the game and lose. Part of that is because the fielding is so bad. And that means the Wolverines had won their 8th game. That means they're the world champs. Did the series end? No. October 22nd, Brooklyn. October 24th, Detroit. October 25th, Chicago. October 26th, they get back to St. Louis. And that's the end. Van der Ahe decides that of the $12,000 he probably made on this series, because the first 5 games rather, brought in a whole ticket price of $30,000, he doesn't give the players a dime. He says, my guys are chumps, they lost. He doesn't give them a dime. So the St. Louis Browns, over the period of 2 years, played over 20 World Series games for free. And at the end of the season, he starts selling off guys because they hate his guts. He sells Crothers, Fouts, and Doc Bushong to Brooklyn for a grand total of $19,000. He sells Kurt Welch to Philadelphia for $3,000. He trades his shortstop Gleason to Philadelphia for another $1,000. He just guts his team. Now, the Browns didn't completely fall apart. They wound up winning the pennant in 1889 because of Silver King. He won 45 games that year, but after that it was over. And Van der Ahe was angry and basically decided that I know what I'm doing. I can run this club. That was the last one. I can run this club. And he runs it straight into the ground. In 1890, the players revolted against people like Van der Ahe and formed their own league, the Players League. About 2/3 of the National League players and American Association players went off and formed their own baseball league. And it nearly bankrupted everybody. All the people who appeared in the Players League were blacklisted, and the National League eventually was able to get a lot of those players back and use leverage against them to completely destroy the American Association. The American Association went out of business in 1892. Chris Van der Ahe, by that point, was pretty much a spent man. And 1890, Comiskey left to go to the Players League. The Browns played well because they're playing basically against a bunch of minor league teams because all the best players are in the Players League. Van der Ahe thinks, I can do this. I don't need Comiskey. Look at how well I did without him. In 1891, the results aren't bad. In 1892, the Browns had 7 different field managers because Comiskey kept running them out. Or not Comiskey, but Van der Ahe. And after 1892, the American Association disintegrated, leaving the National League as a single 12-team league, which they remained until 1901 with the advent of the American League. But the 1890s nearly destroyed the National League. That's a different talk entirely. But Chris Van der Ahe survived until 1913. He's buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, and the statue on top of his stone is actually the statue he had out in front of the Browns ballpark. And it was so reviled at the time that one of the newspaper writers called it Van der Ahe Discovers Illinois. I mean, it's huge. It's like this tall, and it's him going,
Oh my.
you know, it just looks foolish, but it's Van der Ahe. But so when you watch the Cubs, you watch the Cardinals play. Think about Chris Van der Ahe and Spalding, because that's where all this stuff comes from. If it wasn't for people like that, we wouldn't have the baseball that we do today. Especially people like Van der Ahe. It makes me very happy that he's being considered for the Hall of Fame for the pre-integration folks. I hope he gets there. But thank you so much for coming out today.